Good morning, everybody. This is Arthur Brandwood. I'm the CEO of Brandwood Biomedical, based here in Sydney. And welcome to our monthly webinar. This month, I'm very pleased to have a webinar on China. China Update, What's New from CFDA. Presenting the webinar will be Stephen Wen. We're delighted that Stephen has recently joined us as our new Director of China Operations and Senior Consultant, and he's based in our Beijing office, and he'll be speaking to you this morning. Stephen's got a wealth of experience in Chinese medical device and IVD regulatory affairs. He's worked in the industry for more than 20 years, and the last 20 years working directly in regulatory affairs. He's had senior positions both at large multinationals, including Medtronic and GE, as well as in a small startup company and with Bausch & Lomb. It's been a very busy time in China. Most of you will be familiar with the new regulations published a little over a year ago with Decree 650, and then a whole lot of follow-up regulations coming on from that. It seems that barely a day goes by without some new news coming out of China, and Stephen's going to explain all of that to you. Before we begin, just a little housekeeping. You should see your screens, if we can just advance the slide. Yes, you should be looking at a screen something like this with a GoToWebinar view with the slides, and if you press the little orange button with the arrow on it, it will open a control panel, and if during the presentation you have questions, type your question into the box here, this little box with the red, which now got a red rectangle around it. We'll see that question here, and at the end of Stephen's presentation, we'll put the questions to Stephen. We'll have a question and answer session. So Stephen's going to talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have about a 15-minute Q&A following that. So thank you for your attention, and I'll like to now hand over to Stephen, and I'll make the webinar presentation. Thank you, Stephen.
Okay. Hello, everyone. This is Stephen Wen from Brandwood Biomedical China office. I'm very pleased to share with you some latest updates from China's CFDA for medical device. Brandwood Biomedical is specialized in medical device and IVD. We are focusing on Asia Pacific region, and we have very strong global perspective of regulatory evolution. Our network is throughout the regulatory agencies across Asia Pacific, and we are highly engaged in both pre-market and post-market activities. Our headquarters is based in Sydney, Australia, and we have a local office in New Zealand, China, Beijing, and Hong Kong, and our partners across Asia. As you all have known that China's CFDA's regulations keep on evolving over the years. So on June 1st, 2014, the new State Council Order 650 had been put into effect, which had brought huge impact to medical device suppliers all around the world. Order 650 is a framework regulation which covers both the pre-market and the post-market requirements. Since it has been implemented on June 1st, 2014, CFDA had also published a number of sub-regulations on different areas, such as registration, clinical evaluation, post-market surveillance, etc. Today, I would like to summarize those new requirements under each category. So first, registration. So since October 1st, 2014, CFDA has published a number of documents, including the new registration procedure for Class 2 and Class 3 device, the notification procedure for Class 1, the detailed document contents requirements for submission, and the CFDA's internal SOP for review and approval process. On May 27, 2015, CFDA issued the registration fee charge scheme, and the latest regulation issued on November 23, 2015 was the 5 sub-procedures related to registration. So let's take a look at that document. The 5 sub-procedures are as below. The first one is about license reissuing. In case that you lost your license, so you can request CFDA to print a new license for you. This procedure will take up to 24 working days. The second one is a license correction. So in case there are any errors or typos on your license, you can ask CFDA to correct it. This procedure will take up to 60 working days. The third one is a license withdrawal. In case that the approved information are not appropriate anymore, for example, your product had been changed and you have got a new license, you can ask CFDA to cancel the old license. This procedure would take up to 23 working days. The number 4 is about submission withdrawal. In case that you feel the submitted information are not appropriate or accurate anymore, you can withdraw the application and submit it again in the future. This procedure would take up to 10 working days to get your old submission back. The last one is about notification of the user manual upgrade. In case there's any content change to your manual, but without any technical change to your product, you can notify CFDA about this manual change. If CFDA doesn't raise any questions or oppositions within 20 working days, it means you can go on to upgrade your manual. Those are the 5 new sub-procedures related to registration. Next, let's take a look at the clinical evidence. That's going to be the most critical topic for today, I think. So regarding the clinical evidence, since October 1st, 2014, CFDA also issued a number of new regulations, including the exemption list for class 2 and 3 device from local clinical study, and a list of high-risk class 3 medical device need pre-approval for local clinical study, and the administration rule for medical institute to conduct clinical study, and the medical device clinical study notification procedure. And the latest requirements coming from CFDA on May 19, 2015 was the guidance on medical device clinical evaluation report. Today I'm going to talk about some details about this guidance. So first, let's take a review how Order 650 requests the clinical evidence. There are 3 paths to submit clinical evidence. The path 1. So if your product is already in the exemption list, then no need to conduct clinical study or provide clinical evaluation report. You just need to justify your product exactly matching the definition set in the exemption list and make a simple comparison to a marketed predicated device. That's a path 1, the most simple one. The path 2, if your product is not within the exemption list, but you have sufficient evidence on predicated device, we also call the predicated device as the substantial equivalent device. Then you can submit a clinical evaluation report. We also call that CER. The last path, also the most difficult one. If your product is not in the exemption list and you don't have any clinical evidence on predicated device, then you need to conduct clinical study in China. In addition, all clinical studies need to notify local provincial level CFDA, and the high-risk device study need to get pre-approval from the state level CFDA. That's the 3 paths to submit the clinical evidence. So, what's the definition of the predicated device or substantial equivalent device according to CFDA guidance? So first, the basic principle, structural composition, the material, and the manufacturing process, performance, safety requirements, conformity standards, intended use. All those information need to be basically equivalent to the subject device. Second, the variance between the subject device and the substantial equivalent device should not bring any negative impact to the subject device safety or effectiveness. And lastly, it's very critical that the substantial equivalent device or the predicated device must be approved in China already. How to collect the clinical evidence data of the predicated device? The data could be literature search result. CFDA has recommended a number of international or Chinese databases where you can use to search the information, like PubMed, Medline, InBase, etc. Second, it also could be historical clinical study data, and also could be the post-market data, such as the adverse event reporting or corrective actions. How to evaluate the predicated device? So first, you need to evaluate the quality of the literature search result. How strong is the data? And the data classification, categorization, and analysis. CFDA asks you to do a systematic review, for example, using the meta-analysis method. And finally, you make the conclusion based on the data analysis result. If you think the evidence data is not sufficient, you may need to conduct a clinical study. Lastly, how to justify the variance. So for example, some new features on the subject device. It's very critical to remember that CFDA asks you to provide the subject device information, such as the clinical study data, bench testing report, animal study data, risk management, etc., as evidence to justify those new features. If you think the evidence is not sufficient, you also need to think about whether I need to do some additional clinical studies in China to justify those new features. That's about the clinical evaluation path. So next, let's take a look at the QMS stat audit. In Order 650, CFDA had stated that the QMS audit requirements during the registration review cycle, it applies to both domestic and foreign manufacturers. On June 8, 2015, CFDA issued the first detailed QMS audit procedure, which is for the local class 3 device. We anticipate the similar procedures for local class 2 and the import device will be published very soon. Next is about the manufacturing license and the GMP requirements. At this moment, it mainly applies to the domestic manufacturers. On October 1st, 2014, CFDA had issued the medical device manufacturing license and inspection requirements. For local class 2 and 3 manufacturer, they need to apply for the manufacturing license after receiving the registration license. On March 1st, 2015, CFDA published the Good Manufacturing Practice. We also call that GMP requirements. And on October 1st, 2015, CFDA also published the detailed GMP requirements for implantable and sterile products. For any local manufacturers, CFDA will come to inspect the GMP conformity while you're applying for the manufacturing license. So, what's the difference between the GMP and the ISO 13485 requirements. There are many common requirements in both documents. However, GMP sets more detailed requirements to the manufacturing facility, equipment, process management, etc., especially for certain types of device. At this moment, it's an implantable or sterile device. They come up with more detailed requirements. And second, GMP incorporates regulatory requirements in addition to the quality requirements. For example, it requests the inspection procedure and the testing result should comply not only with the manufacturer's own specifications, but also the CFDA approved product technical requirements. Another example, it requests the product manual labeling should comply with not only the manufacturer's own design, but also CFDA's regulation for manual and labeling, which is regulation number 6. Next, marketing, distribution, and use. On October 1st, 2014, CFDA issued the medical device market distribution license requirement for any local class 2 or 3 distributor. They need to apply for the distribution license at local CFDA, no matter the products from local or domestic or international. As far as it's a Chinese company who distributes class 2 or class 3 device, they need to get such a license. On December 12, 2015, CFDA published a good distribution practice. We also call that GDP. For those class 2 or class 3 distributor, CFDA will come to inspect your GDP conformity while you're applying for the distribution license. And on July 17, 2015, CFDA listed a number of high-risk devices they would like to prioritize the market distribution inspection. The latest requirements is about the medical device use. On February 1st, 2016, CFDA issued a rule of medical device use, which specifies the duties and obligations for medical device users. For example, you can only buy medical device from legal distributors, and you need to check the registration license and other qualification documents and the labeling. And you need to set up the incoming inspection procedure and keep the record, the quality record of the device for a certain period of time, etc. So this is a brand new requirement coming from Order 650. It does demonstrate CFDA's intention to expand the administration on medical device to every phase of its life cycle. The manual and the labeling. On October 1st, 2014, CFDA updated the Chinese manual and labeling regulation. It does bring some new and very tough requirements, such as the manufacturing date and the expiration date on the labeling. That's really a challenge to some import device suppliers. You may need to upgrade your Chinese labeling printing system accordingly. Next slide is about the medical device naming and classification. On January 1st, 2016, CFDA issued the medical device risk classification rule. And on April 1st, 2016, the rule of a medical device generic name will be put into effect. It's already published and will be put into effect on next April 1st. So first, let's take a look at the classification rule. So I will not read all the details in this table. I just want to show you that CFDA first divide the medical device into 2 categories, the non-active device and active device. And the non-active category is divided into 3 subcategories by the body contact duration, including the transient, short-term or long-term contact duration. And the active category is also divided into 3 subcategories by the damage level to the human body, including the mild or moderate or severe damage. Then you can check the classification for each type of device in this table. It's very important to understand that CFDA had also published a classification catalog for existing devices. And from time to time, CFDA will announce the classification of some new devices, like a supplement to the existing catalog. So you can first check your device. It is already covered by the existing catalog or not. If not, you cannot find your device in the existing catalog. Then you can check the classification upon this table. If you still cannot be sure by checking this table, you can request a classification from CFDA's Standard and Classification Committee. Or you can always submit as Class 3 directly to the CFDA. The generic name of the medical device. The basic rule is the generic name of any medical device is composed of by one common name and at most 3 adjectives to describe the characters of the medical device. The common name is subject to the basic principle or the structural composition or the intended use of the device. So for example, a pacemaker, stent, syringe, X-ray machine, etc. So the purpose of the common name is to make people easily understand what your device is. And in order to differentiate your device to other devices in the same type, you can add some adjectives in front of your the common name to describe the device characters. However, you can only put at most 3 adjectives there. The adjectives are usually about the device application part on the human body, or the technical features, or the materials. For example, it could be like a cardiac, implantable, dual chamber, wireless, high speed, drug-eluting, hydrophilic, etc. So you can use those words as the adjectives in front of your the common name. Okay, that's all my information to share with you for today. So now we get to the question and answer session. Arthur, would you take the lead?
Unmute, will you? Thank you, Stephen. We have a number of questions. Before we do, I found that a fascinating overview of the requirements in China. If you'd like to meet with Stephen face to face, he'll be presenting again in much more depth at the Asia Pacific Device Summit in San Francisco. Stephen, I think you have a slide for that. Which will come up shortly, which is taking place in March 10th and 11th in San Francisco, where I know Stephen will be presenting in more detail on the current requirements in China, and he'll also be giving a specific session on the clinical evidence report. Now, Stephen, we've got a number of questions around clinical evidence report, and maybe we can talk about that in a little bit more detail. I think John asked clinical evidence reports, specifically whether studies done outside of China are sufficient for device approval. Perhaps you can expand on that a little bit, Stephen, about when you can use overseas data and when you need to do studies within China.
Okay, good question, very good question. So first, it's a very important to understand that the clinical evaluation report, including mainly 2 parts. The first part is about the predicate or substantial equivalent device. Right. The second part is about the variants, such as any new features on the subject device. So currently, according to CFDA, so the clinical study data used or generated in other countries could be used as the evidence in your clinical evaluation report. However, if you think that's not sufficient, you may need to conduct some additional clinical study in China. So if you think that's sufficient, so you can use those worldwide clinical data as a part of your evidence in your clinical evaluation report. But finally, if you judge that it cannot get to a conclusion that it's good enough, you may need to do some additional or a full clinical study in China.
Thank you. Another question on clinical studies from Alexandra, who asks about ethnic differences and what are the effect of that? What's CFDA's view on differences in population and validity of clinical data? Do they have particular requirements about addressing ethnic differences and differences in population?
Yes. Actually, remember, so they ask you to categorize the clinical evidence, and they ask you to search both the international database and the Chinese database, and you need to set up what they call a subset data for the Chinese patients, if any. It's very critical to remember that the condition for the clinical evaluation on the predicate device is that the predicate device must be approved and marketed in China, right? So you need to set up like a subset data for Chinese patients.
So let me clarify that. So you're saying that if you have, for example, clinical data from the United States, where you've got a clinical trial done on a device in the United States, you need to analyze that data to call out the subset of Chinese patients within that trial. Chinese ethnicity patients, yes. Okay.
They prefer that those Chinese patients in China, not only, it could be Chinese patients in other countries, but it's more strong. The data is that how the device, the application in China.
Okay. Now let me just see. Another question from Alexandra on clinical trials, on meta-analysis. Given the, and I just lost the question, I'm sorry, yes, meta-analysis. Given that one goes for the literature pathway to justify performance and safety, are you expected to provide meta-analysis on the literature data? So if you do a literature search, does that mean you have to do a meta-analysis, or is it just an option?
According to CFDA's training material on the guidance, so that's like mandatory requirements. They ask you to do like a systematic review and using the meta-analysis or something similar.
Okay, so there is a need to do something, either a full meta-analysis or some systematic review of the data in the literature. Okay, yes. Thank you. Changing now to a different subject. Satu asks, for China contract manufacturing company, are GMP requirements applicable, and will CFDA audit the site? So I'm assuming that means if you're using a Chinese manufacturer as an OEM supplier or a contract manufacturer for international or supply within China, what's the audit requirements and GMP requirements for contract manufacturers?
This is a very complicated question. So first of all, so if your legal manufacturer is a foreign company, you cannot register a Chinese factory as your OEM or the manufacturing site. So the principle is if the product, the legal manufacturer is a foreign company, the factory need to be also overseas. If you declare the products are made in China, you must have a Chinese local legal manufacturer. The principle is the import device or the foreign device. You can only register the manufacturing site overseas. If you declare that's made in China, you must have a Chinese legal manufacturer. So the scenario you just described is so far is no solution. For example, if you register the legal manufacturer is for American company, but you say my OEM is the manufacturing site is in China, CFDA doesn't know how to deal with that.
I see. So I think there's a separate question there, Stephen. So I understand you're saying that a legal manufacturer providing goods in China, if that manufacturer is, for example, an American company and wishes to supply into China, but is using a contract manufacturer in China, then the CFDA will in fact expect that contract manufacturer to be the registered legal manufacturer. But if the product is taken offshore and processed and further and then re-imported, then that's a little different. But the question is more about what are the GMP requirements for contract manufacturers. And my understanding is that they need to meet the same requirements, but perhaps you could just expand on
that. So if you have an OEM manufacturing site in China, then you ship the product back to US and do some final processing or something, then you declare that's an import device. That's feasible. Then it means that you register the legal manufacturer and both and the manufacturing site all overseas, right? So in that case, theoretically, CFDA will come to audit your overseas, not the OEM in China, because you cannot fill in the OEM in China in your registration application. So theoretically, they will only audit the overseas site. But the question is whether your overseas site can meet the QMS or audit, not the GMP. The GMP requirements only for remember the GMP requirements only for the local manufacturers to get the manufacturing license. It's not for the registration, it's for the manufacturing license. Okay. Manufacturing license doesn't apply to the overseas companies at this moment. Okay.
Another question on clinical trials from Kanu. If there is a clinical trial required, are there CFDA specifics about the number of patients needed, the follow-up periods, the trial design, or can the manufacturer propose those for negotiation? So question is, if you have to do a clinical trial, does CFDA specify the design of that trial, or is that something you can negotiate or propose?
A very good question. So in general, CFDA asks you to ask the manufacturer to design the protocol of its clinical study, and the protocol, the design, need to conform to the statistician's methodology, right? You need to present your statistical methodology. However, for some certain type of device, like X-ray machine, like contact lens, like drug-eluting stent, CFDA had already published the guidance. In the guidance, it specifies the design of your protocol, including the minimum size, how many patients, and what's the end point, and what's the criteria, and what's the statistical methodology, etc. So it means that if the product has already with the CFDA guidance, you just need to follow the requirements in the guidance to conduct your clinical study. But if there is no such guidance, you can design your protocol on your own. And first, you need to get it approved by the ICIC committee, approved by the local statistical expert. Then you can also discuss with CFDA, but there's no mandatory requirements. CFDA reviewers pretty much rely on the judgment of the ICIC committee and the local statistical experts. So did that answer the question?
Thank you. Yes, yes, it does. Thank you. Let's just change tack a little bit here. We have a couple of questions about wireless devices and that sort of thing. So I'm just trying to find the question again. What's the CFDA's position on wireless devices and wireless technology? Does the device and radio technology such as Bluetooth or M-band or Zigbee or whatever require approval from the SRRC in the host while you're submitting application for the device review? In other words, what are there other regulatory requirements around wireless and radio compliance, a bit like in the United States, where you have to have Federal Communications Commission approvals? What are the requirements in China if you've got wireless enabled devices? Are there other regulatory requirements around the wireless part of it?
Good question. Good question. So similar to US, so China also has some particular authorities to regulate the radio, so including either the wireless or some other technology for telecommunications. You also need to get another certificate, just like you mentioned, SRRC's approval. So, which means for those medical device incorporating the wireless or other telecommunication function, you need to get multiple license. One is a CFDA's approval, another is like the radio certificate. We call that the band approval. There are the separate regulations issued by other authorities. So if you like, so we can also provide those requirements later on. But just remember that there are separate registration procedures besides CFDA. You also need to do some local type testing and get a certificate. One good example is that like the pacemakers and the programmers, they all have the like wireless transmission function, right? So usually you need to get two licenses. One is CFDA, and another is the SRRC's wireless band allocation certificate. And in some cases you need to get probably 3 certificates because of the device also have the cable connection into the network. Then you need to get another approval. It's what they call the network permission. It's just like your cell phone. If you look at your cell phone, there's such a mark stick to the back of your cell phone. That's the registration number from the network authority.
Thank you. So there are additional regulations for those things. Okay, turning now to quality systems. Alberto asks, Stephen, can you expand a little bit? Can you give some examples of the differences between ISO 13485 and the China GMP? Just pick a few examples and expand on those.
Yeah, during my presentation, I raised two examples. The first one is about for example, the testing and the inspection process. It's the ISO standard only asks you to you need to conform with your own product specification designs, and in China, so CFDA asks you to also to comply with the approved product technical requirements. Product technical requirements is like a document that you submit in China CFDA, and you perform the local type testing upon that document. So it means that during your manufacturing process, you need to make sure the product will be sustainably meeting that document you submitted and approved by China CFDA. Another example is like the manual and labeling. So your manual and labeling also need to comply to the regulatory requirements, not only your own design, but the approved manual and labeling you submitted. And CFDA's regulation on the manual and labeling does have a lot of more specific requirements other than the ISO standard. So that's two typical examples, and there are many more detailed or specific requirements to the like the facility and the equipment and your procedure, like the testing or inspection procedure. So, for example, for the implantable device, CFDA asks you to build up like a sterile room, the hygiene room for the manufacturing. The level of the hygiene room is much I think more higher than any other requirements around the world. That's detailed requirement.
So there are a whole number of specific technical requirements and references to additional regulatory requirements. And Grant asks, Stephen, is the CFDA planning to use the new ISO 13485, which is coming next month? I know that's the imminent publication of the 2016 version of ISO 13485, the third edition. Any ideas on what CFDA is going to do about that, and whether they'll be taking note of the new changes in ISO 13485?
Yes. So once they adopted the new version of the ISO 13485, so they will start to ask the manufacturers to upgrade to that standard step by step. Sometimes usually they will give like a transition period, but finally they will ask you to upgrade all your system to be meet that requirement.
So CFDA will expect manufacturers who are ISO 13485 certified to upgrade to the new one in time, presumably within the same transition period.
Yeah.
Okay. We've got a huge number of questions here on clinical trials, far more than we can answer this morning, but I'm just going to pick a couple more. The timing of clinical trials, Katerina says that she's heard that the clinical study needs to be finished within a year after the laboratory testing. Is that correct? And what about studies which take longer than a year? What are the requirements for completing the clinical trial after you've done the type testing? Are there time requirements?
Actually, no. The requirement is that you need to start your local clinical study if necessary. If required, you need to start the clinical study within 1 year after.
So the study has to start within a year, but there's no requirement for when it finishes.
Exactly. Some studies take several years, right? It depends on how you design. It depends on the follow-up, right? Yes. It could be several years.
Thank you. Okay. And Alexandra asks about clinical trial sites. Are there predefined clinical sites, or can you just choose to do the trial wherever you like? What are the requirements about where you do clinical trials?
Okay. So in general, so CFDA asks you to do the trial at least 2 sites in China. So you cannot just run the study in one site. You at least 2 sites or multiple sites in China. And more importantly, so remember you cannot do that wherever you like. You must choose the sites from a list. It's called that accredited sites for clinical study in China. At this moment, the official list for the clinical for the medical device sites is not published yet, but they ask you to refer to the sites for the drugs. So, for example, if you search on the CFDA's website, you can see there are currently about 500 hospitals are accredited with the clinical study for the drugs, and you need to check the specific departments in each hospital. For example, this hospital is only capable for the cardiac surgery or the orthopedic or something. So each site is with the different, the capabilities or the qualifications. You need to choose the capable hospital.
Stephen, can I ask a follow-on to that? If you feel that you particularly should do your trial in a site that is not on the list, maybe you've got a particular technology where there are other hospitals which are expert in that technology. Is it possible to negotiate with CFDA to do the trial at a site that's not on the list?
I don't think so.
Right. So you think you still have to use one of those?
Yes,
okay.
Yes.
Thank you. Let me see. Stuart asks a separate question now. What about the situation where you have, say, a Class 2A device, which is not currently registered in China, but is accepted in Europe and the USA, but overseas it doesn't need a clinical trial, but China says it does. What's the circumstance there where you don't have any international clinical data on your device?
Good question. So that's a difficulty for most for overseas companies. But at this moment, so CFDAs are quite, stick to the current requirements. So they ask you, as far as your products are not in the exemption list, you have to consider the clinical study in China, even that's not required in any other countries around the world. But in the meanwhile, so CFDA will expand the current exemption list little by little. So for example, at the beginning, by December of last year, so they published a draft of the second exemption list on the website and asked for comments. The AdverMed had already submitted some comments to and asked them to add more products into the exemption list. So we suppose that the upgraded exemption list with more products will be officially published in around this June or May or something. So it means that CFDA will expand the exemption list little by little according to the advice from the industry. So I think at this moment, so if you don't like to spend money to do the clinical study in China, you can wait for a while, or you walk through the AdverMed or other industry association to advise CFDA to try
Thank
to
you. So I've seen this. So the list is quite conservative at the moment, but it already exempts quite a number of lower risk devices, and that list is likely to grow and increase the exemptions, particularly for lower risk devices. I think we'll take one very last question from Angela, who has to clarify the requirement of the product technical requirement, and says, is this a one-time requirement that you have to do this during the registration, or is this something you've got to meet routinely, and what happens after product registration with regard to the product technical requirement? Now, just to recap, the product technical requirement is a document that describes the performance characteristics and technical requirements for the device, and it's the basis for your type testing, correct? And then the question is, what happens afterwards? So,
Got you. It's not only a one-time document for submission or the local type testing, but also that's approved documents. It's a legal base of your approvals. So just in case that anything happens, like a serious adverse event or any lawsuit from the patient, the first thing they're going to do is to retrieve your product technical requirements approved. Then they may do a follow-up type testing to check if your products are still meeting that requirements. If not, you are in big trouble, which means you are not continuously meeting the approved product requirements. So, as a summary, it's approved information. That's regulated. You need to make sure you are continuously meeting the requirements.
Thank you, thank you. Stephen, we're out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion. I've got a list of very many more questions here. What we'll do, we'll gather up all of these questions, and if your question hasn't been answered by Stephen in the webinar, we'll be in touch with you and drop you a note by email to answer your question. So we haven't forgotten you. Thanks again, Stephen, for a very illuminating presentation about China. There's a lot going on, as you can see. I'll remind you all again, if you want to meet Stephen in person, come along to the Asia Pacific Device Summit. This is, I think, the third time this event has been held. It's a 2-day conference on medical devices and IVDs in Asia, this is a meeting where you don't have to leave the US. The Asia comes to you. This is a 2-day deep dive into the requirements in the different markets around the Asia Pacific, including China, Japan, Southeast Asia, Australia and New Zealand as well. So if you really want to get a good feel for what the regulatory requirements are in this part of the world, come down to San Francisco in March and register. You can see there on your screen the details of the conference, and you can register on the website. I think we'll also, for those of you who've attended this webinar, we'll send you in a follow-up email later a discount code. We'll extend the early bird rate for the webinar participants, so you can get in. And I think there's a $490 saving if you take the early bird rate. So look out for that email. Thank you again, Stephen, and thank you for staying around and listening. We've had a large number of participants in this webinar and far more questions than we could deal with online. We will get back to you. Thank you again, and goodbye and good day from Australia, and good day from Beijing for Stephen. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.